Joe Styx McKinney was dying, and he knew it. Still, as he stumbled through the crimson dust of Olaris 3, he grinned like a man who just found out the IRS had lost his file. Plasma scorched the ground behind him, vivid streaks of green and blue slicing past, while the Vraxen hunters howled in amusement from the ridge. "Come on, boys," Joe wheezed, spitting blood onto the dirt. "You're making a hell of a racket for a bunch of cosmic mall cops." The Vraxens advanced in formation, tall, sinewy figures armored in iridescent plates that shimmered under Olaris's twin suns. They looked like nightmares designed by a committee of bored fashion designers. Joe's rifle, a battered old M19 kinetic slug thrower, clicked on empty. He hurled it at them with a grunt. It bounced harmlessly off a hunter's shield, prompting a round of snickers that sounded like a pack of warthogs gargling motor oil. He wasn't surprised. The Vraxens were notorious across the quadrant. Predators, trophy hunters, egotists so drunk on their own reputation they probably had business cards. Joe had counted himself lucky when the mining gig came up, an easy paycheck away from Galactic. Politics. Then again, McKinney's luck had always been a half-loaded revolver in a game of Russian roulette. One hunter, broader and cockier than the rest, stepped forward, flexing clawed fingers. "You fought well, Terran," he said in broken English, voice bubbling through a translator patch. "Primitive, predictable, entertaining," Joe laughed, a raw, broken sound. "You forgot handsome. Hell of an oversight." The alien cocked his head, confused. Joe sighed and patted his belt, fingers fumbling against the rusted communicator clipped there. He hit the call button twice, old-school Morse code SOS. The device sparked, hissed, and promptly died. He looked up at the hunters closing in, his grin widening. "Guess we'll do this the ugly way." They came at him fast. Joe moved slower, every muscle protesting, every breath a losing argument with his lungs. He ducked the first swipe, felt the second rake across his ribs, tore a knife from his boot, and jammed it under the hunter's arm, before a third drove him to his knees. Blood, thick and hot, spilled down his side. A boot, the size of a Thanksgiving turkey, caught him in the chest and sent him sprawling. Dust filled his mouth, his nose. Joe stared up at the white-hot sky, tasting iron and regret. The lead hunter leaned over him, mandibles clicking in triumph. "Earthlings fall easily," Joe chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. "Yeah, well, so do dumbasses who monologue." He swung the knife one last time. A pitiful, desperate move. Barely a scratch across alien armor. The hunter raised a blade, sleek and black as midnight. Joe didn't flinch. He closed his eyes and thought about the small things, Mom's apple pie, the smell of rain on a hot sidewalk, old rock songs on busted cassette tapes, a lifetime of stubbornness, of gut instinct and bad decisions, and here it ended, under an alien sun. The blade fell. Joe felt the sharp kiss of steel. Darkness rushed to meet him like an old friend. The Vraxens stepped back, admiring their work. The leader kicked Joe's body once, for good measure. Another hunter produced a camera sphere, recording the scene for their galactic fans. They traded jokes in their guttural tongue, confident the Terran had been taught his place. "Primitive," one muttered, tapping Joe's battered communicator with a sneer. "Back up," another snorted, spitting on the dirt. "No one comes for dead things." They gathered around a small fire, unpacking their kill trophies, giddy in that ugly way bullies got when they thought no one stronger was looking. One of them strummed a victory chant on an instrument that looked suspiciously like a stolen Fender guitar. The suns dipped lower, painting the desert blood red. Shadows lengthened. Low hum rolled over the horizon. Faint at first like a swarm of angry hornets. The Vraxens tensed, scanning the barren landscape. The hum deepened into a growl. Lights flickered against the clouds of dust. A ship, if you could call it that, screeched into view, wobbling like a drunk stumbling out of a bar at 2 a.m. It was ugly. Patched hull plates, scorched wings, visible duct tape securing a cracked engine mount. Earth engineering at its most feral. The Vraxans stared, confused. This wasn't a military craft. This was an insult wrapped in scrap metal. The ship landed hard, kicking up a storm of grit. A panel fell off. Sparks flew. A door slid open halfway, then jammed. Someone inside kicked it with a muffled curse, and it finally clanged open. A figure emerged through the swirling dust, silhouetted against the setting suns. Leather jacket. Aviators. Combat boots. A giant cigar jammed between gritted teeth. The figure slung a duffel bag over one shoulder and sauntered toward the hunters like he was heading to a barbecue, not a battlefield. "Hey, dipshits," he called, voice carrying over the whine of cooling engines. "Someone order a wake-up call?" The lead hunter roared a challenge, stepping forward with a ceremonial blade raised high. The others flanked him, claws and plasma rifles at the ready. The newcomer didn't blink. He dropped the bag at his feet, popped the cigar out of his mouth, and grinned. The Vraxans hesitated. There was something wrong about that grin. It wasn't the bravado of a man outnumbered, or the desperate defiance of the doomed. It was worse. It was the easy confidence of someone who had seen worse odds, and had made the odds regret it. The human cracked his knuckles. "Name's Reaper," he said almost conversationally. "And you boys are about to learn why Earth doesn't send diplomats anymore." In a blur, he kicked the duffel open. Grenades, knives, and what looked suspiciously like a super soaker filled with acid spilled out. The lead hunter barked an order. Plasma bolts tore the air. Reaper moved like a force of nature. He ducked low, snatching up 2 grenades, yanking the pins with his teeth and hurling them into the densest clump of aliens. The explosion rattled the valley, sending Vraxans flying like confetti. Sand and armor fragments rained down. The hunters regrouped, furious now, charging en masse. Reaper laughed, deep and wicked. "Finally," he said, pulling a sawed-off shotgun from inside his jacket. "A real party." The fight turned savage. Reaper danced between plasma blasts, boots pounding over the rocks. His shotgun barked, tearing through shields and flesh. He fought dirty, mean, and brilliantly human, using every trick Earth had perfected in centuries of bar brawls, street fights, and bad action movies. One Vraxan tried to flank him. Reaper whirled, smashing a thermos full of hot coffee into the alien's face. The hunter shrieked, armor sizzling. Another charged head-on. Reaper sidestepped, stuck out a foot, and sent the alien sprawling into a cactus-like plant bristling with venomous spikes. The lead hunter finally reached him, sword flashing. Reaper caught the blade between his hands with a grunt, wrestling it aside, head-butting the alien with enough force to crack a helmet. He planted a boot against the alien's chest and kicked him backward onto a mine cleverly hidden beneath a discarded helmet. The resulting explosion painted the dusk in fire. Panting slightly, Reaper wiped sweat from his brow. Around him, the surviving hunters limped and crawled away, howling for reinforcements. He walked over to Joe's still body and knelt. "Come on, Sticks," he muttered, fishing a battered injector from his jacket. "Ain't got time for a nap?" He jabbed the needle into Joe's neck. There was a tense moment, then a coughing fit as Joe convulsed back to life. Joe blinked blearily up at Reaper, blood still caked on his face. "Am I dead, or is that really your ugly mug?" "Both," Reaper said, hauling him up. "But mostly the ugly part." Joe coughed, clutching his side, but his grin returned, stubborn as ever. "You bring a medivac?" Reaper slung Joe's arm over his shoulder. "Nah, I brought payback." Behind them, the horizon shimmered as more ships descended, dust kicking up, in massive clouds. But these weren't alien vessels. They were human, and they were armed to the teeth. Joe laughed weakly. "Hell, Reaper, you always did know how to make an entrance." Reaper grinned, lighting a fresh cigar. Buckle up, Sticks. It's about to get biblical. Above, the stars blinked into life, cold and distant, oblivious to the chaos about to unfold. And, on Alaris 3, death itself had just clocked in for a double shift. Joe stumbled forward, each step a negotiation between stubbornness and pain. His ribs ground together with a nauseating crunch. Reaper kept a firm grip around his shoulders, half dragging, half carrying him across the broken ground. Behind them, smoke curled into the twilight, acrid and thick, marking where the first of humanity's revenge had landed. They made it to the battered ship, where a second figure waited, smaller, wiry, tapping one boot impatiently against the ramp. His name was Mason Quill Duran, demolitions expert, escape artist, and certified maniac. He wore a grin as sharp as a razor and a bulletproof vest covered in stitched patches from wars no one wanted to remember. "About time," Quill said, tossing a battered flask toward Reaper, who caught it one-handed. "I was about 10 minutes away from playing taps for you two clowns," Reaper grunted, hauling Joe up the ramp. "Situation's gone sideways. Full Vraxen company, stationed on the next ridge." Quill's grin widened. "Good. Means we're right where we need to be." Joe leaned against the inner bulkhead, breathing shallowly. "Someone want to tell me the damn plan before I bleed out all over your ugly ship?" Quill's eyes gleamed. "Same as always. We blow something up and pray real loud." The ship's engine coughed to life under Reaper's rough coaxing. He slammed the controls with a familiarity that suggested most of his piloting experience had been learned through mistakes and collateral damage. As the vessel lifted, buffeted by the swirling desert winds, Joe tried to piece together the chain of insanity that had led him here. 3 weeks ago, he'd signed a mining contract, thinking he'd be digging up minerals, not dodging death squads. Somewhere along the line, the Vraxens decided Olaris 3 wasn't enough. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted blood. And Earth, ever the unruly child of the galaxy, had sent its most inappropriate answer: Reaper and Quill. Joe coughed again, tasting copper. "You're telling me 2 lunatics and a bucket of bolts are humanity's grand retaliation?" Quill laughed, buckling himself into the gunner's seat. "Nah, pal. We're just the opening act." The ship banked hard. Through the cracked viewport, Joe could see flashes of light on the horizon. Plasma artillery lighting up the dark like an angry god's fireworks display. Reaper's face was grim, the faint glow of the console panels etching deep lines into his skin. "We hit their command post," Reaper said, voice clipped. "Take out the comms relay. Fry their fleet's nav systems. They can't call for reinforcements if they can't find their own asses." Joe nodded weakly. It was a good plan. Reckless enough to work, suicidal enough to be remembered. The ship shuddered as anti-aircraft fire peppered the sky. Quill cursed, hammering the turret's controls. A streak of plasma ripped past, close enough to fry the hair off a less lucky man. Reaper yanked the yoke hard, diving low. "Hang on to your teeth." They skimmed the desert floor, kicking up a wake of dust and debris. In the distance, a fortress loomed, an ugly cluster of spires and turrets grown like tumors from the bedrock. The Vraxens didn't do beauty. They built structures the way butcher shops built freezers, functional, grim, and hard to break into. Joe forced himself upright, every movement screaming in protest. "You two planning on telling me how we're getting in?" Quill winked. "Front door, obviously." Joe groaned. "Of course." The ship hurtled toward the fortress. Alarm klaxons began to wail from the spires, a discordant chorus rising into the night. Searchlights swept the sands, catching glints of the battered ship's hull. Joe tightened his grip on a side rail. "Any backup coming?" Reaper's smile was all teeth. "We are the backup." They hit the wall hard. The ship's battered nose smashed through ferrocrete like a battering ram, tearing open a screaming wound in the fortress's perimeter. Metal screeched. Stone exploded. Joe's world turned sideways as they crashed through, landing with a bone-jarring thud. Before the dust even settled, Reaper and Quill were moving. Joe followed, limping but furious, shotgun clenched tight in his hands. The fortress interior was chaos. Vraxans scrambling for weapons, shouting commands, firing wildly into the swirling dust. Reaper and Quill carved a bloody path through them, ruthless and efficient. Joe focused on staying upright and picking his shots, each blast of his shotgun hammering another alien back into the darkness. They reached the central spire, a massive structure humming with energy. Cables the size of tree trunks fed into it, pulsing with sickly green light. Reaper jerked a thumb toward a maintenance hatch halfway up the wall. "Quill, plant the charges. Joe, cover." Joe braced himself against a half-destroyed console, firing slug after slug as Quill scaled the wall like a spider hopped up on adrenaline. Reaper moved with him, blasting any alien dumb enough to show their face. Quill reached the hatch, pried it open with a crowbar, and started setting explosives. With manic precision, Joe could see his lips moving, probably humming some obscene tune. Plasma rounds tore through the air. Joe ducked, heart hammering against shattered ribs. A squad of Vraxan enforcers barreled down the corridor, armored to the gills and looking pissed. Joe grit his teeth and stepped forward, pulling a smoke grenade from his belt. He yanked the pin with a twist of his fingers, hurled it into the advancing squad, and grinned as the corridor filled with choking gray fog. Reaper laughed, a savage, barking sound. "Attaboy, Sticks!" In the chaos, Joe and Reaper picked off the confused aliens one by one. Quill's voice crackled through their comms. "Charges set. Fireworks in T-2 minutes." "Copy," Reaper growled. "Time to make ourselves scarce." Joe turned, lungs burning, legs trembling with the effort of moving faster than a crawl. Reaper scooped him up again, practically throwing him through the wreckage of the inner gate. They burst back into the courtyard just as a Vraxan war machine, a hulking, multi-legged mech bristling with weapons, thundered into view. Joe's heart plummeted. "Tell me you've got a plan for that thing." Reaper gave him a crooked smile. "Improvisation." The mech opened fire. Rockets and plasma stitched the ground, carving craters in the sand. Reaper dropped Joe behind a ruined barricade and took off at a dead sprint toward the fortress wall. Joe struggled to his knees, blood dripping down his face, and watched in disbelief as Reaper scaled the wall, grenade in hand. The mech turned, tracking him, too slow to realize what was happening. Reaper reached the top of the wall, flipped the grenade safety, and hurled it straight into the mech's primary exhaust vent. He didn't even watch it explode. He just dropped from the wall, rolled to his feet, and jogged back toward Joe with the easy grace of a man who had made a lifelong habit of surviving stupidity. The mech detonated, fire and shrapnel lighting up the courtyard. Quill whooped in triumph. "Now that's what I call a distraction." Joe coughed weakly. "Someone remind me why I'm friends with you idiots?" Reaper pulled him upright again, slinging Joe's arm over his shoulder. "Because no one else is crazy enough to get you out of messes like this." The fortress shuddered beneath their feet as Quill's charges began to blow. One after another, the cables feeding the comms spire exploded, spewing sparks and molten metal into the air. Sirens wailed, lights flickered and died. Above them, the Vraxan fleet ships hanging in orbit began to drift, their formation unraveling like beads slipping off a broken string. Joe watched the chaos unfold, a grim smile tugging at his battered face. They'd done it. Cut the head off the beast. Now it was just a matter of cleaning up the mess. Reaper dragged Joe toward the waiting ship, Quill sprinting ahead, laughing like a man who had seen too much, and decided the only sane response was insanity. As they stumbled up the ramp, Joe caught a final glimpse of the fortress collapsing inward, a monument to alien arrogance brought low by human stubbornness. The ship's engines roared. They lifted off just as the ground where they'd stood moments ago vanished in a pillar of fire. Inside, Joe sagged into a chair, every bone aching, every nerve frayed. Reaper tossed him a water bottle and dropped into the pilot's seat with a grunt. Quill buckled himself in, still grinning like a lunatic. "Not bad for a warm-up, eh?" Joe wiped blood from his mouth and laughed, low and bitter. "You lunatics better have a real plan for the rest of this war." Reaper glanced over his shoulder, eyes glittering. "Oh, we've got a plan." Outside, the stars stretched wide and cold, and Earth's vengeance had only just begun. The ship cut through the upper atmosphere like a wounded hawk, trailing smoke and rattling under the strain. Joe braced himself against the bucking walls, his battered body protesting every vibration. Reaper barked short, clipped commands, fingers, flying across the console, keeping the failing craft barely ahead of the pursuing Vraxan interceptors. Quill leaned over his chair, a mad gleam in his eyes. "We've got 2 minutes, maybe 3, before they catch us. Ideas?" Reaper's jaw tightened. "We can't outrun them. We're ditching this heap." Joe's stomach twisted. "We're ditching? In what?" Reaper jerked his head toward the cargo bay. "Pods. Emergency evac. Old, ugly, but they'll do." Joe cursed under his breath but forced himself upright. His legs trembled, the crash and the fight sapping what little strength he had left. Quill was already moving, throwing open a locker and pulling out battered escape pods, barely bigger than coffins, welded with more hope than engineering. As Quill and Reaper wrestled with the pods, Joe caught his reflection in a cracked panel. Blood-streaked, bruised, eyes hollow but burning. He wasn't the same man who had signed that mining contract. He wasn't even sure he was still a man who believed in simple survival anymore. The ship shuddered violently, a plasma bolt shearing off one of the remaining stabilizers. Warning sirens howled. Reaper shoved Joe toward a pod. "You first, Sticks." Joe hesitated. "What about you?" Reaper's grin was grim. "I'll be right behind you." Quill barked a laugh. "Lies. He just wants to make a dramatic entrance later." Joe climbed into the pod, feeling its cramped interior close around him like a tomb. Reaper slapped the hatch shut and punched the launch code. The world tilted, then fell away as the pod ejected, spinning wildly into the void. He gritted his teeth against the centrifugal force, trying to focus on his breathing. The tiny screen flickered, showing the other pods hurtling down through the atmosphere alongside him. 3 bright comets against the endless dark. Moments later, the mothership exploded, a blossom of fire and debris lighting up the sky. Joe didn't allow himself to think about what that meant for Reaper and Quill. He forced his mind onto the immediate problem: surviving the landing. The pod slammed into something hard, bouncing twice before coming to a grinding halt. Darkness enveloped him. For a long, dizzy moment, Joe lay still, listening to the crackle of the emergency systems kicking in. Then he kicked the hatch open and dragged himself into the open air. The landscape was a nightmare. Jagged rock formations, sulphurous clouds rolling across a broken horizon. The ground cracked and shifted underfoot, releasing noxious gas with every tremor. Joe squinted up at the sky, barely making out the other pods in the distance. His comm crackled. "Sticks! Status!" Joe grinned despite himself. "Alive. Where's my taxi?" Reaper's voice crackled back, rough but alive. "Working on it. Stay put. Regroup at smoke signal." A thin black column was already rising in the distance. Quill's doing, no doubt. Joe started limping toward it, shotgun at the ready. Every step was a fresh lesson in agony. But he kept moving, the alternative unthinkable. He didn't get far before the Vraxans found him. They rose out of the ground like ghosts, camouflaged, armor blending into the sulphurous landscape. 4 of them, heavily armed, moving with lethal precision. Joe raised his shotgun, but his battered body betrayed him, his arms trembling too hard to aim. The lead Vraxan barked something guttural and gestured for him to drop the weapon. Joe considered dying right there, taking at least one of them with him. But he thought of Reaper, thought of Quill. thought of Earth waiting in the cold dark beyond the stars. He lowered the shotgun. The Vraxans seized him roughly, dragging him toward a waiting transport. Joe didn't resist. He gathered every ounce of strength, storing it, like coiled wire. He would need it soon. They threw him into the transport, chaining his hands and ankles. One of them slammed a gauntleted fist into his stomach for good measure. Joe doubled over, coughing blood, but kept his expression blank. They spoke in low tones, arguing. He caught fragments through the translator implant, words like interrogation, execution, orders from high command. Joe smiled grimly. They didn't understand humans at all. The transport lurched into motion, engines growling. Joe flexed his fingers slowly, testing the chains. Old, rusted, probably repurposed from local mining operations. Sloppy. Vraxans thought he was beaten. They thought humans broke as easily as machines. They were wrong. Minutes passed. The transport hit a rough patch, throwing the guards off balance. Joe moved, swift and brutal, twisting his wrists and dislocating a thumb to slip free of the cuffs. Before the nearest guard could react, Joe drove his forehead into the alien's snout, with all the strength he could muster. Bone crunched. The Vraxan staggered, howling. Joe grabbed the alien's sidearm and shot the second guard point blank, plasma burning a smoking hole through armor and flesh. The third guard lunged. Joe ducked under the wild swing and jammed the barrel against the alien's gut, pulling the trigger twice. Silence fell. Joe slumped against the wall, breathing raggedly. His vision swam, but he forced himself upright. He kicked the transport's rear hatch open and stumbled out into the night. The smoke signal still rose in the distance, a promise he wasn't ready to break. He started walking again. By the time he reached the signal, Joe was half delirious with exhaustion. He collapsed behind a jagged boulder, shotgun clutched tight, ready to make a final stand if necessary. Footsteps approached, too light for Vraxans. Quill crouched beside him, grinning like the mad bastard he was. "Knew you'd make it," Joe tried to smile but ended up coughing instead. Reaper appeared behind him, blood streaking one side of his face, armor scorched but intact. He crouched, checking Joe's wounds with a practiced eye. "You're a stubborn son of a bitch," Reaper said. Joe rasped. "Takes one to know one." Quill handed him a canteen. Joe drank greedily, the water tasting like heaven despite the metallic tang. "We've got a bigger problem," Reaper said. "Vraxan High Command's moving fast. They're not just cleaning up, they're escalating. Total. Occupation protocol." Joe wiped his mouth. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Quill said, "they're bringing in the heavy hitters, siege walkers, orbital strikes, full extermination teams." Joe's heart sank. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for humanity's place on this world, and maybe beyond it. Reaper knelt, sketching rough maps in the wet dirt. Their staging grounds about 10 clicks north. Heavy fortifications, mobile artillery. If they lock it down, we're screwed. Joe leaned closer, studying the crude lines. His mind felt clearer now, sharpened by the knowledge of what was at stake. "We blow it," he said. "Before they finish setting up," Reaper nodded. "Exactly." Quill cracked his knuckles. "Sounds like my kind of party." Joe looked from Reaper to Quill, feeling a grim sense of belonging settle over him. These weren't just mercenaries or madmen. They were family, forged in fire and insanity, bound by blood and stubbornness, and they were about to make the Vraxans regret every decision that had led them here. Reaper stood, slinging his rifle over one shoulder. "We move at dawn. Hit them before they expect it." Joe rose shakily to his feet, feeling the weight of the coming battle settle on his shoulders like an old, familiar coat. No backup, no reinforcements. Just 3 broken men against an empire, and, somehow, impossibly, Joe believed they had a chance. The night wind howled across the shattered landscape, carrying with it the scent of ash and ozone. Joe grinned into the darkness. Tomorrow would be a good day for war. Joe crouched in the shadows, heart pounding against cracked ribs, sweat stinging his eyes. The Vraxin staging ground sprawled before him like a mechanical cancer, towers of steel and plasma arrays pulsing under the pale alien moons. Giant siege. Walkers loomed, their legs braced against the unstable ground, cannons humming as they powered up for the inevitable assault. Reaper lay flat beside him, surveying the battlefield with cold precision. He tapped a battered datapad, highlighting weak points: the fuel depot, the command node, the artillery clusters. Quill knelt on the other side, his hands dancing over the improvised explosives he'd cobbled together from stolen parts and salvaged tech. His grin was savage, the expression of a man who found peace only in chaos. The plan was simple. Hit hard, hit fast, cripple their capacity to wage war before they realized humans weren't beaten. No backup, no margin for error. They had one. Shot to turn the tide before the Vraxins tightened their iron grip on the sector. Joe adjusted the stolen rifle slung over his back, feeling the battered stock dig into his shoulder. Every muscle in his body screamed protest, but he silenced the pain. He had bled too much, lost too much to falter now. They would carve a warning into the bones of this planet, a message the Vraxins would carry back to their empire. Humans did not break. Reaper clicked his comm twice. Time to move. Joe exhaled slowly and slipped from cover, a phantom in the toxic mist. They split apart, three shadows threading through the chaotic sprawl of the enemy camp. Joe made for the artillery. Lines first, keeping low behind crates and machinery. Vraxin soldiers prowled the perimeter, their guttural voices rasping in the thick air, oblivious to the humans slipping past them. He reached the first walker's support platform and knelt by the fuel line. With quick, sure fingers, he wired the explosives Quill had prepared, setting the detonator to a hair trigger. A low whine vibrated through the ground as the artillery prepared for calibration fire. Joe's gut twisted at the thought of those weapons turned against the human enclaves scattered across the planet's surface. He checked the timer, lips tightening. Not today. He moved on, setting charges in a practiced rhythm. Each one brought a thin, sharp thrill, one step closer to vengeance, to justice, to survival. Across the camp, faint pops of suppressed gunfire echoed, Reaper clearing a path to the command node. Joe allowed himself a grim smile. If anyone could bring down their communications in one brutal strike, it was Reaper. Joe reached the central fuel depot, a maze of tanks and pumps shrouded in vaporous leaks. Perfect. He slipped between the tanks, wiring the final bomb. The moment the first charge blew, this entire depot would light up like a dying star, taking half the staging ground with it. As he secured the last charge, movement flickered at the edge of his vision. He spun, shotgun raised. A Vraxin officer stood there, elegant in his battle armor, a cruel smirk twisting his alien features. He barked a command, and a dozen soldiers materialized from the mist, plasma rifles aimed at Joe's heart. Joe didn't hesitate. He dropped flat as the first volley tore through the space he'd occupied. Rolling behind a tank, he triggered the emergency beacon on his comm, a prearranged signal to Reaper and Quill. Plan B gunfire erupted across the camp as Reaper went loud, cutting down Vraxins with cold efficiency. Explosions ripped through the southern perimeter where Quill had planted secondary charges, sowing confusion and terror. Joe popped up and fired, the shotgun's blast knocking the nearest soldier off his feet. He grabbed a fallen plasma rifle and laid down covering fire, forcing the Vraxins to scatter. The officer snarled something into his comm, summoning reinforcements. Joe knew he couldn't hold them off forever. He ducked another volley and sprinted for the extraction point, weaving through chaos as the first of the timed charges detonated. The artillery line vanished in a searing eruption of flame and shrapnel. Siege walkers toppled, their towering forms collapsing into the smoking wreckage. Screams filled the air, a symphony of alien panic. Joe staggered through the maelstrom, lungs burning. He caught sight of Reaper ahead, cutting down a Vraxxin squad with surgical brutality. Quill appeared beside him, wild-eyed and laughing, dragging an unconscious soldier by the collar. Joe skidded to a halt beside them, coughing. "Change of plans?" Reaper smirked. "Improvised, as usual." Quill tossed the captive Vraxxin at Joe's feet. "High-value target, officer grade, might be useful." Joe didn't waste time questioning. He grabbed the alien's arm and hauled him upright. "Move!" They retreated under covering fire, racing toward the extraction beacon Quill had rigged. A battered human dropship hidden in the nearby cliffs, jury-rigged to barely functional. The ground shook as the fuel depot detonated behind them, a towering fireball devouring the staging ground. They didn't look back. The dropship shuddered as it lifted off, engines coughing against the strain. Joe slumped into a seat, cradling his battered ribs, staring out the cracked viewport at the devastation below. The Vraxxin command post was gone, reduced to a crater of molten metal and shattered ambition. Reaper piloted with grim focus, dodging, sporadic anti-air fire. Quill manned the jury-rigged turret, cackling as he picked off stragglers. The captive Vraxxin officer lay bound at Joe's feet, glaring with impotent hatred. Joe leaned closer, meeting the alien's furious gaze. "You thought we were broken? That humans would roll over and die?" The officer hissed something unintelligible. Joe smiled thinly. "You don't know anything about us." Reaper barked a laugh. "They will." The dropship broke atmosphere, angling toward the shadowed side of the planet where human enclaves still held out, pockets of stubborn resistance clinging to life. Joe rested, his head against the bulkhead, exhaustion pulling at him, but sleep would not come. Too much blood, too much loss. And yet, beneath the weariness, a hard, relentless core remained. They had struck a blow tonight, not just in battle, but in spirit. A message, clear and undeniable. Humanity fights back. Reaper set the dropship down at a hidden outpost, little more than a network of tunnels and camouflaged bunkers. Men and women swarmed the landing pad, rough and battered, but alive. Fighters, engineers, medics, survivors. As Joe stumbled down the ramp, a cheer went up. Someone clapped him on the shoulder. Someone else thrust a canteen into his hands. He drank deep, the water washing away the taste of smoke and blood. Reaper hauled the Vraxxin officer forward, presenting him to the gathered humans like a trophy. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Hope, disbelief, grim satisfaction. Joe met Reaper's eyes and nodded. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were winning. In the command center, they secured the prisoner and reviewed the stolen data Quill had ripped from the Vraxxin systems. Maps, troop movements, supply chains, everything they needed to keep striking, keep bleeding the invaders dry. Joe leaned over the holographic map, tracing potential targets. The war wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but tonight proved something vital. Humans could not be conquered. Reaper clapped him on the back. "Ready for round 2? Joe allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. "Born ready." The alarms blared suddenly. Proximity sensors tripped. Reaper's face hardened. "They're coming." Joe grabbed his shotgun, feeling the familiar weight settle into his hands. His body ached, his vision blurred, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. Let them come. They would find humanity waiting, teeth bared, hearts unbroken. And this time, there would be no mercy.